Hi, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to hear what I think is going to be one of the most exciting speeches and interviews in our Leading Voices series. This has been a series that's been going on all summer long, where we brought in some of the leading lights on a whole variety of policy issues, and we've really enjoyed all of them. Although this is on a topic, Joel Klein is here to speak on school reform, and it's a topic near and dear to my heart. And certainly, those of you that have children and work in education are going to be fascinated to hear what he has to say. We're absolutely honored that he would come here, not just today, but this is his second visit in as many months, and that's really a terrific thing. I was trying to think about how did that come about, and I realized that the last time he came, we gave him a degree, and so now that he's an alum, he's like all of our alums, and we can't get rid of him. So he's now a member of the Dartmouth family. I'm not going to focus a lot on his accomplishments other than school reform. Let me talk about what he did to earn his Dartmouth degree. He's got a doctorate. He holds a doctorate of humane letters, and from Dartmouth College, recently awarded. And there's a couple of things that led to him being so recognized. And let me give you a couple of numbers. I think the most important number to keep in mind in my head is 12%, which is the number of percentage points that he raised the New York high school graduation rate from 2005 to 2010. He was the chancellor of the New York school system from 2002 until recently, but along with a number of trends that were happening, he put in place a huge number of reforms that led to massive increases in the graduation rate and also in test scores. Let me show you something about test scores here. Maybe if I can bring up the first slide. This is just one quick. I just cannot talk to an audience without using PowerPoint and statistics. This shows you a graph of math scores in New York City over time from 2006 to 2010, and you can see that there are just these are scaled scores, big increases for all groups, particularly for Black and Hispanic students. So you actually, not only do you have growth for all groups, but you have a closing of test score gaps between Black and white students, Hispanic and white students. And to make this meaningful, I should say that you see these 25-point gains in scores. This student level standard deviation on this test is about 35 points. So you're talking about like something approaching 2/3 of a standard deviation growth. I mean, that's just a huge change. That's something like, people talk a lot about using smaller classes. Well, this is like 3 times. So you could either give every classroom another 2 teachers, or you could give the whole system Joel Klein, and you get the same effect. So without further ado, I'll now give Joel Klein to you and let him talk in depth about this. Thanks very much. Please welcome Joel Klein.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you all for being here today. You can't imagine what a privilege it is for me to be a proud member of this Dartmouth community. I've been blessed in life with many things, but the honorary degree I got from this college will be right at the top for so many reasons. It's an extraordinary institution, and I was particularly privileged to get it when your new president was President Jim Kim. His vision and his leadership, in my view, are really quite special and quite unique, and to see him leading this great college, I think would make Noah Webster proud. So Jim, hats off to you. And now to talk a little bit about education. And I wanted to start, because there's a whole memory that's converged on me, I wanted to start with the first time I came to Dartmouth, which was a little over a decade ago. And at that time, the chairman of your board, I believe, was Bill Newcomb, who was the general counsel of Microsoft. And I was in the process of suing Microsoft for antitrust violations. So it was, as we say, an awkward moment. Now, subsequently, probably because I sued Microsoft, which was not a career-enhancing move, I ended up as chancellor of the New York City Public Schools. But of all interesting things, my largest financial backer was Bill Gates, who had given me well over $100 million to support the work, in particular breaking down big dysfunctional high schools in high-poverty communities and replacing them with smaller schools that were getting significant results. And And I'll never forget the first day when Bill came to New York, because everybody wondered whether he had given us a $10 million grant before I got there, would he continue to support us? And everybody wondered about that. And so he came, and we had an incredible day. It happened to be at an old high school that had been broken up, the high school my father had gone to, so it was deeply emotional. And I hadn't seen Bill since the litigation, and those of you who know, this was a pretty brutal and pretty aggressive litigation. And so it all went well, and I was feeling really good about the day. Walked off the stage, my heart started to beat again, and one of my principals tugged at me, and Bill had given us $50 million. He said, you know, Chancellor, he said, $50 million, terrific amount of money. He said, think what Gates would have given you if you hadn't sued him. And so that's when I knew, and it goes back to your president, leadership really matters, and that principal was obviously a great leader. But you know, Bill recently said something, I think it surprised a lot of people, particularly given what the country's going through now, both domestically and globally. He said the greatest challenge our nation faces is the education challenge. The system is deeply broken, and it's a message that's so important for the people in this room to hear, because obviously if you're here, the system hasn't failed you, it's worked wonderfully for you. But of all the crises we face, whether it's current unemployment, the deficit, the debt, all of those kinds of issues, I believe Bill nailed it when he said this is the biggest challenge, because we're on a trajectory that I think will change the fundamental structure of our country. And it's something that over the past 8 years, I've been privileged working for Mike Bloomberg to be able to see this from the inside and to be integrally involved in school reform. But I want to start with a little bit of history here, because I want to suggest to you that the path we're on is not only troubling, but is proven to have failed us. So it was in 1983 that we had a nation at risk, familiar to many of you. And at that point, we said we had a rising tide of mediocrity in K-12 public education that threatened the very future of our nation and our people. We talked about if a hostile foreign power had imposed the results we're getting on us, we very likely would have considered it an act of war. That's extraordinary rhetoric. Here we are almost 30 years later, and what's happened? I think this is really powerful. In that 30 years, America has doubled in real dollars, inflation-adjusted dollars, has doubled our investment in K-12 education. We have increased by almost 50% the number of teachers, lowering class size, having many more people. We've increased our non-teaching force, guidance counselors, support, and other people. And we've raised wages, increased benefits, and what's the effect? I think it's fair to say it's been flat. If you look at the national tests in high school, which everybody admits are a fair assessment of overall ability, from 1980 to now, essentially flat in math, science, and reading. So here we are investing twice as much and not getting results. Now that should trouble people enormously, because we don't have a going forward big dollar investment play right now. State and local government are particularly challenged financially, and they have massive benefit and pension obligations that are going to make it harder and harder to divert money to increase our real spend on K-12 education. So we've got to think very, very differently, and that's hard, because the one thing we all know is the status quo, understandably, has lots and lots of defenders. And the status quos don't just arise. This is a complex, literally the second largest after healthcare spend in our country. So lots of people are living off of it. And therefore, transforming it or changing it is going to be an enormous challenge. But let's look at a couple of things. I mean, when I say the results are flat, you know what that means in college readiness today? It means even though we pretend to have a 70% high school graduation rate, in fact, our high school graduation rate, if it were really meaning people who are ready for college, would be about 40%, maybe even lower. And so we have so many kids who are going to be, by definition, underprepared. While our performance is flat, two things have changed that are critical. And one, I think most people don't understand, and it's important we understand it. The skills that the future workforce is going to need are going to be entirely different. The technological revolution is not going to enable us to find the manufacturing jobs and the agrarian jobs and the other jobs that fueled our economy 30, 40, 50 years ago. When I started public school in New York City in 1950, over 60% of our workforce were high school dropouts. Today it's about 6%. And even today we know, with all the unemployment, we've got a massive problem of people not having the skills for the jobs that are available. So if your education line is flat and the demands on your workforce is going up exponentially, you are going to create this enormous gap. And that's the gap that I believe threatens the kind of nation we want to be. Second things that change is globally. We now compete in a global economy. All these arguments about whether we should have state standards or national standards, the kids in Indiana, the kids in New Hampshire are competing with the kids in China and India and all throughout and Brazil and all throughout the globe. And so we've got to understand that this is an entirely different economy. And while America's performance globally has remained essentially flat as well, the rest of the world is eclipsing us. So if you look at the international tests, it's not just in math and science we're toward the bottom, but we're so far away from so many other countries. So this, to me, is why Gates is right. We've got this crisis, and the implications of the crisis are to really dramatically impact the kind of country. If you read Claudia Goldin and Lawrence Katz, they're two Harvard economists, forgive me for citing them up here at Dartmouth, but occasionally even a Harvard economist can write a great book, Bruce. So, not always. So, but Bruce got his doctorate up there, so that's why I brought it up. But you know, if you read this book, if you think about what's the magic ingredient in the sauce of this country that draws immigrants throughout its history from all over the world, that doesn't have a shared religion or necessarily a common heritage. What is the magic ingredient? It is this thing we casually call the American dream, that a kid like me who grew up in public housing can be here today as a member of this community having received an honorary degree. Now that is what I think is in peril here. How did we achieve that? By leading the world in education. In the first half of the 20th century, we were the first country that adopted universal secondary school, right? So we believed that we could create a more equitable, more egalitarian society. Post the Second World War, we massively expanded, not just government, but private philanthropy and others, our college-going rate. And if you trace this through the 1980s, what you find is the growth in our educational attainment paralleled the growth in our technological advancement. So as demands grew on our workforce, our kids had the skills necessary to meet those demands, and our college-going rates increased and so on and so forth. From 1980 to now, our technological advancement is outpacing our educational attainment 2 to 1. And as a consequence, we are creating that divide. So what's going to happen if we stay on this trajectory? Our technological advancement going up, our educational attainment flat, this gap's going to widen. And what does that mean? That middle class we created in the second half of the 20th century is going to be increasingly hollowed out. We're going to have a very powerful, successful entrepreneurial class and a professional class to service the entrepreneurial and related functions, and then increasingly large, underemployable, unemployable, underclass in this country. And that's going to why when people talk about a nation at risk, or guys like me who are not normally hyperbolic talk about these challenges, that's why I use the word crisis. And no more, this crisis is no more apparent than when it comes to poor kids or children of color in America today. If you think the overall picture is glum, the picture for poor kids and children of color is devastating, and we see it in all our universities. A recent study written up by David Leonard in the New York Times pointed out that our top 200 most competitive universities in America, 2/3 of the kids who go come from the top quarter of the income spectrum. 2/3 from the top quarter. How many do you think come from the bottom half? 15% from the bottom half. If you look at college-going rates of African American and Latino students, it is gaping how big these gaps really are. And so the overall picture as an overall threat, and then the increasing challenges we face with these achievement gaps. So again, I hope, if nothing else, that you get your head around this, because if we don't fix this, I think so many of the other issues we face are not going to be fixable, because if we have an increasingly large underclass, it'll not only polarize our society, but it'll make the economics of what we need to face entirely different. Now, the second point I want to make to you today, because it's a point that seems to be confused in the discussion. It seems to be a notion in some quarters particularly by defenders of the status quo. It's not that the education system is broken. There's something wrong with these kids, particularly kids who grow up in poverty, and there's only a little bit that education can do to transform the lives of kids in poverty. Now, I'm not a fool. I grew up in public housing. I understand the challenges that kids who grew up in families where perhaps you don't get read to a lot, or families where there's drug addiction, or families where there's dysfunctionality, et cetera, et cetera. And that does make the challenge very different. But there's so much research now, and I've seen it so many times, the exact same kids in different schools getting entirely different results. It doesn't mean that poverty and dysfunctionality aren't barriers that create additional challenges. But it does, on the other hand, that doesn't mean that we can afford to strike out or need to strike out when it comes to educating kids who come from the most challenged environments. There's a school in Harlem called Harlem Success. It's a charter school. It's getting outsized results. It's an entirely African-American Latino population, about 2/3, 70% free and reduced lunch. This is a classic kind of high poverty school. And it is outperforming virtually all the other schools in the city of New York and both our science tests, our math tests, and our reading tests. It's performing at the level of a gifted and talented. Now, that's an exceptional school. But this notion that somehow we should take the burden off of us because these kids come with all these challenges is nutty to me. In fact, from the day I took this job, even my friends used to say, you know, you'll never fix poverty in America, and you'll never fix education in America till you fix poverty in America. But it's exactly backwards. We'll never fix poverty in America until we fix education. Now the question, a couple of guys are nodding, thank you. Now the question is why? It's broken and fixable. Why? Why do we double our investment in real dollars, increase our manpower by multiples, and we're stuck? And here I think is the critical question, we got to talk about it honestly, is as I said at the outset, these kinds of structures where you're talking about investing literally billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in education each year, these kind of structures have enormous defenders of the status quo, not for malevolent reasons, but because it developed in a way that serves lots of interests, particularly the interests of the adults in the system. So if you are somebody who's in a system that provides you after 25 or 30 years a full lifetime pension at pretty close to the salary you were making, notions about firing teachers become very, very threatening. Notions about restructuring pay, moving away from across-the-board pay hikes to merit pay become very, very threatening. And so the people who are in the system, understandably, not for bad reason, but for perfectly legitimate reason, want to protect the existing structures. There are so many rules that protect the most ridiculous kinds of things. I mean, simple things. For years, I used to have these small schools, and I used to say, we don't have enough teachers. And Bruce has been involved in this in a program in New York called REACH. We don't have enough teachers if only 3 kids want to take advanced placement. But there are great advanced placement courses online. Let the kid take it. If he passes it or she passes it, they get college credit. Surely they can get high school credit. But in New York, they had this ridiculous rule called seat time. And what was seat time? Seat time meant if you didn't have a live teacher, you couldn't get credit. Now, it's hard to explain to most rational people that if you can get college credit, you should be able to get high school credit. But we had a rule that blocked. You see, you're laughing. But let me tell you, I was crying because literally thousands of kids in my city who could have been taking advanced placement courses online and passing them were unable to do so. Now, what's that rule about? Let's be candid. It's a simple feather bedding rule. In other words, we want to make sure we have a live teacher, grow the number of teachers, good for the union, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we have. When I was general counsel for the American Psychiatric Association, I needed a joke, and people who grow up to be chancellors usually are not people who are good with jokes. So I memorized one joke that I use all the time, and it's apropos entirely of the story in K-12 education. And the joke is, you know, some of you older remember there was a raft of light bulb jokes recently. How many of this it take to change a light bulb? It was about 20 years ago. And my favorite one was, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is only one. But the light bulb really has to want to change. And what I found out about Thank you. You see, some people from my generation. Thank you. But what I found out about the K-12 education system, the thing that surprised me most was that it didn't want to change. Sure, it wanted additional money, and sure, more money is a good thing. But there was so much centrifugal force toward the status quo. And the changes, and New York was a beacon of reform. The changes we saw over the last 8 years, as important as they were relatively small compared to the dimensions of the challenge. And that, to me, is really the core message. Are we prepared, those of us who are the beneficiaries of a great education system, those of us for whose future an America that has a thriving middle class, not an increasing gap between its higher performing people and its underclass, is this worth fighting for? Because if it's not going to change. When you have massive amounts of money and manpower defending the status quo, and then you're saying to people, well, let me show you a future that you can envision that's better, the risk of change becomes overwhelming, and people cleave to the pre-existing status quo. And that's what I think the real candid circumstances. So to me, let's talk about a couple of things that I think could have a significant impact, but that would be highly disruptive. And let me start with what I think is, in some respects, an American solution, right? And I think we can take a leaf from America's universities in this regard. America's universities tend to be viewed throughout the world, for all the challenges that we face, tend to be viewed as the best university system in any nation, anywhere. Our state universities, obviously our great private universities, et cetera. But as a system, it's viewed that way. And our K-12 system, if you go any place, is viewed as broken. Now, one core difference is competition. This university attracts some of the most talented kids throughout the world, but it has to compete with other universities. And if you don't have something that makes this better than someplace else for that kid, then that kid has a choice, because the kids who come here could go to lots and lots of places. And choice drives things. It keeps Jim Kim thinking about what changes do I need to make so that increasingly more of the most talented kids come here. Because the more talented kids who come here, the more talented kids will want to come here. And you create a positive feedback loop. K-12, on the other hand, was essentially a monopoly provider. And I used to always joke that I went from suing Microsoft, which I portrayed as a private monopoly, to running the largest public monopoly in the world. And I think in many ways one of the most important things we did is start to inject real competition. Now I want to talk about this because people have this view competition is cutthroat and all the other things. But as I say, competition helped drive a great university system. And every one of you, I bet, for your kids, you'd always insist on choice for schools. I've never had a lecture, and I suspect today will be no different, where anyone raised their hand when I asked the following question: would anybody here allow me randomly to assign your kid to a public school in New York? Would anybody allow me randomly to assign a kid to a public school? So who ends up at the schools that you wouldn't allow your kid to go to? It's obviously the kids with the greatest challenges. The kids whose parents can't say, if the school in my neighborhood is no good, I'll move. Because education is far too important to let my kid go to a crummy school or pray that somebody in the central office will fix it. And so choice really becomes aligned with economic status. And that's entirely backward. We need to increase choice, particularly in those communities where the greatest challenges exist. Because, again, I understand why the system would push back. If I have choice, maybe a lot of kids won't go to that school. And if they don't go to that school, then they won't need as many teachers. And if they don't need as many teachers, then I got to find a different job elsewhere. And I understand those dynamics. But I submit to you, in the absence of choice, people get awfully, awfully complacent about the work they do and the way they do it. So the thing that struck me most, there were two things when people say, what shocked me about K-12? One is they never talked about excellence. Never. It was like, I don't understand organizations in which excellence is not part of the culture, DNA, and backbone. And second of all, innovation was frowned upon. If you tried something different And indeed, if you failed, it was an A1 story, and if you succeeded, nobody knew about it. But if you tried something different, it was thought of, you're experimenting on kids. And I'd say, how about the experiment we're currently conducting, which is failing our kids? And so you've got to think differently. Are there ways to use technology? Are there ways to use software? Are there ways to extend the day and extend the year? Look at some of the programs like KIP, which have an entirely different model, or the Harlem Children's Zone that Jeff Canada runs. And why don't we want to bring all the dynamism and innovation into this market? The way you're going to do that is create a competitive market and give people options. One of the worst, most insidious things I ever heard was that lots of people in high poverty communities don't really care about their kids' education. In Harlem today, next to New Orleans, which grew about because of Katrina, in Harlem today, it's the greatest choice zone in the world. And parents have a choice of 25 charter schools in addition to 25 or 30 public schools, traditional public schools. And you would be amazed at how robust that process is and how much information they have. Fairs for parents to learn about the schools. These parents go to lotteries in order to get their kids in. And the traditional myth that somehow they don't care has been blown apart. What they didn't care about is when you told them it was one and done. Because for those people, they couldn't move. They couldn't put their kid in a private school. But now that they have a robust choice system, and the results you're seeing in Harlem are quite extraordinary. Those of you who read Caroline Hoxby's piece, you'll see, are really quite extraordinary, driven by a choice model. Does that disrupt a lot of people? Sure it does. But to me, that's got to be a core element of the solution. The second element of the solution, we've got to think in the future very differently about the way we recruit, train, reward, and deal with the whole teaching profession. You know, when I went to school in New York City, a fortunate product, not to justify it, but a fortunate byproduct of sexism was that women disproportionately went into teaching when I was a young kid. And we had extraordinary teachers. This is not an argument for sexism. I don't want to be misunderstood. But what's happened in the last 30, 40 years is increasingly the people we've drawn into teaching, somewhat changed now by Teach for America and other groups, are coming from the bottom of our college graduates. We have got to make teaching the preeminent profession in America. There's nothing more important to our future. That has got to start with the ed schools thinking very differently about their mission. They got to stop being defensive and start thinking about the rigors of the education they provide. We've got to think differently about the way we reward teachers. We've got to stop putting in place a system where everything is so back-ended, pension and healthcare driven, that people stay in the system whether they want to or not. Because after 10 years, it's economically nuts to leave the system. We've got to think about why we pay math and science teachers the same as we pay physical education teachers. And this is not a knock on phys ed teachers. What this is economic reality. If you don't differentiate, you're going to be short math teachers. I was chronically short math teachers. And when I was short math teachers, which kids do you think didn't get qualified math teachers? The kids in the high poverty or the kids in the affluent communities? So it's a very different way to think about it. And yes, in the end, nobody likes to talk about it. We got to talk about it. Not everybody's great at teaching. You know, when I was a kid, and I'll end here, I wanted to be a point guard for the New York Knicks. See, everybody laughs. They said, short Jewish guy with a bald head, what's the odds, right? But I wanted to be a point guard. It was just one problem. I can't shoot, and I can't run, and I can't rebound. But otherwise, I had all the requisite talent. Not everybody is great at teaching. I don't have to tell you, you've all had teachers. And we got to be honest about that. It can't be a jobs program. So to me, to wrap this, if we really want to have a future in which the American dream doesn't become the American memory, we've got to talk openly and honestly and critically with each other. But for me, after almost 9 years toiling in this vineyard, I'm quite convinced in the absence of real competitive dynamism, innovation, and professionalization of teaching, we're not going to change the basic outcomes. I hope you'll join in this fight. Thank you very much.
Thank Boy, I've already broken the mic. I said it would take 10 minutes, but it took 1 minute. Thank you very much, Chancellor. This is terrific. You know, it's funny because I think Jim Kim often talks about his aspirations of being a professional basketball player. There's an organization in Cambridge called It's Never Too Late Basketball. So we may be able to get, I visited them once, they renamed it. It's Almost Never Too Late Basketball. So there's a lot of things I want to ask you. Before I get into my, and I have 5 pages jammed into my sport coat of things I want to ask you, but we have a tradition where the prior speaker gets to ask the first question. And you lucked out because we had a very intellectual and thoughtful person come through 2 days ago, Governor John Huntsman. Far too smart to be running for president, but certainly very good at helping us do our job, which is thinking about what to ask you. And he said, well, here's what I'd like to ask Chancellor Klein. Suppose that vouchers and charter schools and school choice is a very important part of the solution. Is there a role for the federal government? Is this largely or purely a state and local thing, or does the federal government have a role to play in that form of school choice? And if so, what should the federal government be doing?
So that's a great question. So let me say, I do think the federal government has a role, but I think it's interesting that he would ask the question, because I remember, I think it was in the 80s when then Secretary of Education William Bennett said, America will never have national standards. The Republicans don't do national, the Democrats don't do standards. And that seems to me to sum up where the Huntsman question comes from. But I actually think President Obama, through Race to the Top, has certainly on charter schools, has stimulated and fueled the expansion. Just last week, New York State got a ton of money to grow charter schools. And I give him a lot of credit, because charter schools are not particularly popular with large constituencies in the Democratic Party. And so he's driving that agenda, and as is Secretary Duncan. And I think, yes, through incentivizing, you could do it. Look, in America today, about 9% of our overall educational spend, which is about $600 billion, about 9% of that is federal dollars. And in that, it seems to me you could find a way to incentivize things, which is something we haven't done. So in New York State, when we used to have these fights, because our charters were working, and so people tried to block the expansion, finally when there was big federal dollars, like $700 million federal dollars at stake in New York, when that occurred, that led us to be able to change the political dynamics. So the answer to this question is yes, but he's got to convince other Republicans that somehow a hands-off federalist approach to K-12 is not the right way to do it.
Excellent. So let's talk some more numbers here. I looked up on the Department, New York City Department of Education website and found that there are something like 135,000 employees. These are my numbers. I hope they're roughly accurate. Only about 80,000 of those folks are teachers, right? Which makes me think that this system is so big, and there must be some huge, or there might be some huge diseconomy of scale to trying to run it as one big system. And when you talked about the Harlem's Children's Zone and all the charter schools up there, it sounds much closer to what we do here in New England, which are small, spread out school systems with some local control. So were you ever tempted to bust up the system? I mean, has that been talked about? I mean, there was actually some consolidation, within the last 10 years. So did you ever think that was a possible direction?
I didn't think so as a practical matter. I didn't think it was going to happen. I'm not sure what the right scale size is. It's a question of how you effectively manage it. And what I did it in 2 phases. The first phase, I tried to depoliticize the management. When I started, there were about 40 school districts, and each one had its own little school board. It was highly politicized. And when the mayor got control, we changed that, rolled them up into essentially 10 regions. It was a very top-down, but it was an effort to depoliticize. But then we moved away toward what I think is now going to get a big play. And Paul Hill at Washington University, I think, has talked a lot about this, to much more portfolio management. In other words, what I think the district should do is stop being the key operator and let the schools be operated, and those that succeed, you reward, you expand, you let them grow. Those that don't succeed, you shutter. It's always very, very controversial to close a school. And when I was chancellor, we closed almost 100 of them in New York City. And just last week, the judge ruled that we could close 22 more. So my own view is this notion that there's a Wizard of Oz, whether it's for 100 schools or 1,000 schools that can adopt policies and improve them all, strikes me as a kind of nutty notion. And yet that's what we have going on in America, whether it's relatively small schools. So in fact, one of the problems we have is just the opposite problem. There's some diseconomies of non-scale. So you have a superintendent for 3 schools, and then he's got to have or she's got to have a head of HR. I mean, we should do more consolidation, but I've never been convinced what the quote right size is. Good management could figure solutions at the right size, at virtually any size, I think.
So here's my last question. I'm going to throw it open to the audience. So a lot of the narrative, if you read, there's been some great articles. One in the Atlantic by you, and a story by Stephen Brill, I believe, in New York Times Magazine. There's that famous rubber room story, and there's lots of stories about Michelle Rhee and Arne Duncan. And so much of the narrative is about reformers, very thoughtful chancellors and heads of school system, and researchers versus the teachers' unions. You know, it's kind of like the thing that's stopping us from trying new things is the teachers' union. How much of that narrative is reality, and how much of it, you know, one is always suspicious of simple solutions, right? Or sort of, so, you know, oh, well, the problem is this is the fundamental thing that's going on. So how much of it is, in these big cities, really is this conflict between the unions and the reformers?
So I think there are 2 dimensions to this question. First of all, there are school systems throughout the country which are not mandatory unions, not getting particularly good results. And there are places throughout the globe, like Finland, which are unionized and getting very good results. So I think one wants to be careful in how you analyze this. What I do think right now is what I said in my remarks, is that in most large urban areas, we have this problem of a very baked-in status quo. And I think I don't think this is a demonization claim. I think this is a fact of life that the unions are expected to protect that. So let me give you a fight we had in New York just this year. We were contemplating, the mayor was thinking he had to lay off about 4,000 teachers. At the end, he was able to avoid it, but for much of the year, it looked that way. And the current rule is last in, first out. Now, one of the things I knew as a fact is that in the years I'd been there, we had brought in, and there were independent studies by Tom Kane and others showing that the teaching force we had brought in was strengthened. They were coming from different colleges, higher SATs, et cetera, all the indicia. And if they were the first ones to go, particularly in high poverty neighborhoods, that would have had a deleterious effect. That doesn't mean that some of the senior people weren't great teachers and that some of the junior people shouldn't have gone, but we wanted to move toward a merits-based termination policy. And you can understand, from the union's point of view, that's very threatening. People who have been in the system a long time, have much more power in the union, et cetera, et cetera. And so those kind of clashes are very, very harmful. And in that respect, my own guess is if the union is going to move, it's going to move because the politics, the engagement of the people move, and nothing will move it more than if they have to earn their students. The reason Michelle Rhee, I think, it's not the only reason, but the reason she was able to get the most radical union contract in America was because in the 10 years before that, the DC school system had lost about 25% of its students, 30% of its students to charter schools in DC. And all of a sudden, that pressure began to mount in terms of, we don't do something differently, we're going to end up losing all of our kids. So I don't think it helps to frame this in terms of demonization, but I do think to understand it in terms of current economic realities is critical, because if you don't, it's not going to be able to change it.
Terrific. All right, good. So we're going to go to audience questions, and there are mics in the aisle, I hope. I'll remind you that a question ends with a question mark, does not contain the words News Corp, and News or Corp, and it does not start with, isn't it true that? So with that in mind, go ahead.
Hi. So I had a question, I guess, about, with a lot of the sort of proposed reforms for increasing teacher quality, it's looking at test scores and things like that. And on the elementary level, that makes sense. It's, a lot of these tests are statewide or nationwide tests. But when you get into high school level with kids taking all sorts of different levels of classes, and some kids are taking APs, others taking regular classes, how does that kind of work in assessing, using standardized tests, which seems, sort of easy in the elementary system? How does that translate into the high school system for finding good teachers at that high school level?
It's a challenge, and I don't think there's a simple answer. If you don't have year-to-year tests where you can measure progress, it's quite difficult. But essentially, I think what people will start to do in the beginning will do is what we're doing in New York is we have college-ready metrics based on your 8th grade scores. So we look at how the high school does in terms of what its expected graduation rate, college-ready rates will be, and measure that way. We look at year-to-year promotion, and we try to standardize that and look at progress. And again, all based on what your entry school into the system is. None of these are simple, and standardized tests, particularly many of the standardized tests that are being used right now, are not particularly good, and they have to be changed. One of the reasons I've always been for kind of common core standards is I think we need to take our standards to a very different level, and then we need to bring in tests that test many more of the skills that we want. I think the current tests are really, in some respects, too basic, don't really push kids on higher order thinking and so forth. But I do think we can devise, and different states will devise different methods of measuring what you want to measure. The real question is, can we develop a culture of excellence and a culture of performance in a system that respects seniority more than it respects performance?
Go ahead, Cyril.
Chancellor Klein, it seems to me like providing tenure to K-12 teachers is a very contentious issue, but has many perverse incentives. So I was wondering if you can comment on what your thoughts are on providing tenure and whether you can reform the system with so many different
So
interests.
first, just answer one question. If they gave me an honorary degree, can they take it away? Because coming to a university and talking about tenure is never going to make you a popular guy unless you say absolutely. So, no, I think tenure in K-12 is not a good idea. I mean, whatever arguments there are for academic freedom, this is not an academic freedom argument. And it used to be maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when there was all sorts of arbitrary behavior where race and other factors weren't protected legally the way they are now under Title VII and so forth. In this environment, I don't think you need tenure to protect against arbitrary firings. I think we should have fair processes for people that, based on adequate evaluations, which the last woman asked me about, but I don't think tenure makes any sense anymore. And if you read the Brill piece on the rubber room, it's really extraordinary to pay teachers for 3, 4, 5 years. If you've engaged in serious harmful behavior, sex with a kid, and you know, and your lawyer knows, that you can sit in a rubber room all day and get paid for 3 years while your case drags out, every incentive is misaligned. So I would move away from tenure to what I consider to be a fair evaluation system with reasonable, timely reviews, but not the kind of lock-in. It's interesting, just today in the papers in New York, and the New York Times has a story about it, under a reform that the mayor initiated last year, we used to give tenure, when I started, to about 99% of the people. Just yesterday, fewer than 60% got tenure. Most of them were carried over, eventually may get tenure, but I think that's going to become the issue. If you're stuck with lifetime tenure, then you want to be very careful about whom you give tenure to. And universities are, certainly good universities are very careful about that.
Excellent. Go ahead. I think this gentleman had his hand up.
So, Chancellor, in a system with a lot of charter schools and also a big school system, how do you make sure that the innovations that emerge in great charter schools get to everywhere else?
It's a great question, and the way you make sure that things emerge is two ways. First, you create an environment in which they can emerge, right? So, if, to me, what I said, and I said it to be provocative and tendentious, was I wanted to create the Silicon Valley for charter schools in New York City, right? I wanted to see the Googles and the Facebooks and all of that in terms of what was going on, and it's happening. I mean, from K-12 to the Equity Project, which pays teachers a starting salary of $125,000, to other kinds of very different models, Harlem Success, KIPS, and so forth. So you want to create an environment in which you get innovation and differentiation. And then you want to do everything in your power to make it transparent. And so what we used to do, and some schools responded well and some schools didn't, by giving them a cluster of schools that they could measure their performance against and actually publishing report cards or progress reports on them, we were saying to them, look, if you're not doing well, here are 20 other schools that have the same kids, same English language learner challenges, same special ed challenges. Look at the ones that are doing well and go visit. And we clustered schools into networks of 20. They self-affiliated, and then they could learn from each other. And when I saw something that was exciting or big, I used to put it every week in my column in Principals Weekly that I used to send to people. But in the end, the last point I would make on this is what I call a GE, not invented here problem. You've got to get people to want to find out about best practices and bring them into their culture. Most organizations, even in the private sector, have what's called the NIH, not invented here. So even though it's a great practice, we don't do it because that's not our thing. And one of the things I've learned is if you want to create a world of incentives, incentivize learning from others every bit as much, if not more than, incentivize having people innovate on their own.
Would you talk a bit about the pros and cons of Race to the Top? Tell us how to judge it, whether or not to push for more money in it. Tell us what the politics of it are. Does it have promise?
I think it does. Like any such program, I think it could be improved. But basically, what they try to incentivize, you remember a couple of years ago where we had the major stimulus package, and they put something like $1 trillion to about 780 billion to try to stimulate the economy. In that, they put somewhere around 100 billion for education and about 5 billion for Race to the Top. And as a result of that, that stimulated, I think, significant reform. The kind of law changes you saw in New York on the charters, lifting the cap, on trying to get a real evaluation system so that we professionalize teaching. You saw that in Colorado, where a young Teach for America alum named Mike Johnson, who went into the legislature there, passed a bill that ultimately I think could have long-term impact on trying to, again, professionalize. So I think they were able to incentivize a lot of the good things. I think some of the ways they applied it, sometimes they relied on factors that I thought were probably not as good as it should be. But as a model of federal legislation to try to leverage incentives, something that feds rarely do. Think about it, they usually give away somewhere in the neighborhood of, I don't know, about 15, 20 billion in Title I or money like that. They give it to you on a kind of per pupil basis, whether you're good or you're bad, so you get virtually no incentive. So I think thinking about using federal programs to incentivize desired outcomes is a good one. I think Race to the Top was a good example.
I would certainly agree that there are many teachers who should not be teaching, and would certainly expect you to agree that there are many teachers who are outstanding. And I am struck by how little their voices are used by the leaders in the reform movement, and how you don't hear from them as much as in other fields. They are brought into the solutions.
I absolutely agree with you. First of all, I agree. They're teachers, they're extraordinary teachers. In New York City, I never went into a building that I didn't see a teacher who was off the charts. And second of all, the problem is how to get that voice into the debate in a way that's not simply the union voice. And that's where I think the reform movement has not been as successful. There are some things that are beginning to happen now. There's a group in New York, a group in California, a group in New York. It's called Educators for Excellence. And they've become an association that has now brought teacher voice into the discussion. And I think that's been terrific. But there's too much homogeneity of teacher voice being expressed simply through the unions. And how we kind of crack the code on that, I think, is a very important thing. And I know Michelle Rhee in her group called Students First is looking very hard at how to bring teacher voice. John Schnur, who created New Leaders for New Schools, he's put together a group of very, very talented teachers who are getting increasingly involved in the policy debate. But you're absolutely right. And to be truthful about it, if it doesn't happen, it's going to be very hard to move the needle.
Chancellor, could you talk a little bit about the effect of No Child Left Behind on the New York City public schools and what you think ought to happen to that legislation going forward?
Yeah, so No Child, I think, is again one of these things where it had some good elements to it. It had some, I think, in the end, needs a significant revision. To me, the biggest problems were two. One, they relied on the state testing without any benchmarks to ensure some reasonable standard. So if you want to improve outcomes, there's two ways to do it. Have the students do better or have the tests get easier. And far too often the tests got easier, and that served no one's interest. And they could have done things like benchmark and align it with the national tests, et cetera, et cetera. Second thing they did is measure performance rather than progress, which seems nuts to me, because that measures what a kid brings to the school, not what a school does for the kid. So if you take a 4-point scale, to me, it's a whole lot more important that you take a kid who is a low level 2 to a high level 2 than it is you keep a kid who's a mid-level 3 at a mid-level 3. That's really important, and that gets zero value if you're a mid-level 3 and you stay there. Or indeed, if you go from a mid-level 3 to a low-level 3, you get the same credit under No Child, whereas if you go from a low-level 2 to a high-level 2, you get no credit. So that seems nuts for me. And third, I thought the sanctions in the end were too timid. If you're unprepared to close schools, then in the end, what you're largely going to engage in is deck chair rearranging exercise. And No Child, I think, in the end, didn't execute on its sanctions policy. But I should say, while you're moving the mic, the one thing it did, that I thought was critical, is it made the country look square in the eye of these racial and ethnic and poverty achievement gaps. And so people could stop, pretend, and start to get real about the fact that these gaps are going to kill us.
Thank you. Speaking of sanctions, considering that Race to the Top is more of a sort of positive incentive program where money's offered if they meet these certain benchmarks, what sort of sanctions do you think the federal government could actually provide? What sort of sticks would a federal government program look like with regard to national schooling?
So I think a couple of things. One, they're trying to do this, but it's very hard, is to close down non-performing schools. This notion that somehow the Wizard of Oz can fix non-performing schools with some magic, which usually means more resources, I think it's demonstrably false. Andy Swarrick and others done research on this, and we've invested. In New York, we used to invest lots and lots of money. Sometimes the conditions are not right, and sometimes the culture of the school is simply not right. In either of those cases, you've got to shut them down. Second, I would be prepared to think about ways to, derivative of that, cut off money for underperformance. We tend to reward underperformance and then take away money if you perform. So you get additional dollars if you're a so-called failing school or a school in need of improvement, a CINI, which is, all these acronyms are ridiculous. If you're a non-performing school, you get more money. Then if you get out of your CINI, school in need of improvement status, then they take away the money. So you send all the wrong rewards. We should say to those people, if you get out of it, we'll give you even more money and incentivize the behaviors we want, not incentivize the behaviors we don't want.
Go ahead.
There's one challenge to K-12 that you haven't really talked about, and that's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Could you talk a bit about the challenges that the New York City school system faced in dealing with that question?
It's enormous, and the other challenge I didn't talk about, which I should have, just to mention it because you reminded me, is the whole 0 to 5 piece. We're wasting the critical years, particularly in kids who come from those challenged environments. I mean, the most Sisyphusian aspect about what I was trying to do was when I would see these kids come in kindergarten, and they had some kids had a vocabulary that's 20% of other kids' vocabulary, and I'd see them make progress over the year, and then over the summer, they'd fall back behind. We're just not thinking about time. My friend Cory Booker says it best. He said, right now, we hold time constant in education, and we let outcomes vary. Why don't we think about reversing that and hold outcomes constant and let time vary? And that goes to the special ed thing as well. Look, we're not doing a good job with general ed kids who don't come with special needs. So what are the likelihood that we're going to be doing a great job? We're not thinking very intelligently about this. The special ed population, partially because of No Child Left Behind, is that population that people want the least of. We try to incentivize under our progress reports. The more progress you got with special ed kids, you got double credit and extra credit, and to try to get people engaged. And again, we're not thinking in innovative, differentiated ways. It seems to me there's such opportunity in technology to use and engage special ed kids in a very different way. The last thing we ought to think about, which is very politically unpopular, why we bifurcate the world into special ed, general ed. So again, if you have a kid who is not performing particularly well, you can get additional dollars if you put a label on them. And so instead of, why not get them the services and forget about the label? But if you got to put a label on them in order to get the services, it drives a label. Or if you're worried about the testing dimensions, say to them, okay, put the kid in special ed, and then we can say special ed kid. And so the continuum of student need in a complex city like New York is enormous, and we should acknowledge the need and stop the categorization and labeling.
All right, well, I think I'm going to cut the questions off there. We've got one more order of business. On August 4th, former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich will be here, also a fellow alum. And we typically have today's speaker ask the future speaker questions. So is there anything you'd like to ask Secretary Reich?
My good friend, Bob Reich and I've known him for, I don't know, 45 years, or something, 40 years. And we worked in the Clinton administration together. And I would like to ask him, I think he's probably going to come up here and talk about, from a different lens, what I was talking about sort of the widening gap between the haves and have-nots in America. And I'd like him to tease out how much of that gap is a product of policies and how much is it a product of the fact that we're not training skills for the training kids for the skills that the market will demand. In other words, how much can you solve through income redistribution, and how much of this is going to require us to ensure that our kids have the skills that the 21st century global economy is going to demand. So, and I trust there's a mechanism for me to hear back for you, because I'd love to hear Bob's answer to that.
That's right. We will get that to you. Well, thank you so much. It's been a really wide-ranging and incredibly informative discussion. So, thank you.